The climate conference in Copenhagen is in its second week, and readers from all over the world have been sending questions to our website. The Times' Andrew Revkin, our environmental writer who's been covering this issue for many, many years, is there in Copenhagen and has been there from the start. He's here with us now to answer some of those questions. Andy, we have a question from Daniel Lipman in Washington, D.C. He wants to know, why are European governments and European citizens more dedicated to cutting carbon emissions faster and deeper than most Americans and the American government?
Well, Europe for decades, actually pretty much since the end of World War II, has been much more thrifty with energy generally. The average European emits about half as much carbon dioxide as the average American. For an American, through the course of a year, it's about 20 tons a year. In Europe, typically it's about 10. So some of that's just kind of come naturally because fuel prices are higher, resources are scarcer. Also, when the Kyoto Protocol, the climate treaty that came into effect several years ago, Europe signed on to that. We didn't. One reason they had an easier time is because of some things that were happening in Europe just historically. The United Kingdom moved away from coal and toward natural gas, the big natural gas finds in the North Sea. And Germany, when it absorbed East Germany, they turned off a lot of inefficient old factories, and that gave them a big gain under the system as well. So it's a kind of a mixture of habit. When you go into a building here, anywhere here, all the hallway lights are on timers or motion-activated things. And we in the States just aren't attuned to this yet like that.
Andy, these questions are coming from people all over the world, and here's one from Germany, someone called Old Stone 50. He wants to know, what role does world population size play in global warming? And if it plays a role, is there some way in which population control ought to be part of the climate discussion?
Well, yeah, all the texts that are being batted around here in Copenhagen in these treaty talks, the word population I have yet to see in any one of these texts. It's a really tricky situation when you get into global negotiations to talk about population growth. For a lot of reasons. I've written a lot about it, and I've gotten hammered when I've mentioned population in a climate context. That's when Rush Limbaugh not long ago suggested I kill myself to save the planet. If I thought there were too many people, why not start with me? So it's one of these hot button issues, and it's fascinating. Sub-Saharan Africa is probably going to double its population in the next 50 years, and that's a big deal. But the United States is going to add probably 100 million new Americans in the next 40 years. Every one of those is what you might call a super emitter. Again, we have very high rates of emissions per person. That's mostly through immigration, but the atmosphere doesn't care if it's a baby or through someone moving to a country. If you create a lot more high polluting people, that's an issue. So population is implicitly part of the calculation of how much of these gases go up and how warm the world gets.
Now, Andy, I have two questions related to protesters. So let me give you the first one. Thomas from somewhere in the U.S., he describes himself, he wants to know who's financing the travel and accommodations for the tens of thousands of activists in Copenhagen. What's their political affiliation, and especially what organized groups do the black-clad shock troops belong to?
I think it's a little hard to determine in some cases. Those the black masks, as they were called, right. My guess is, from what I understand, they're mostly people from the region. And remember, Europe is a small place. You just hop on a train or a bus or hitch a ride and you get somewhere. I don't get the impression they're a well-financed bunch. They had homemade shields and paint bombs, not anything more sophisticated than that. The mass of protesters that were here is everything from college kids in the United States. I met a young man on the train last night leaving the protest, and he had taken the bus from Paris. He just kind of hopped on the bus and felt he wanted to be here. So he clearly was not part of any organized effort. There were also counter protesters, as I reported on .earth with my video report. There were some libertarians, anti-regulatory folks who were making a strong statement in the plaza as well. I don't know who paid their way, but they were there as well. So it's kind of clearly the dominant mass there were people who were very eager to attack greenhouse gas emissions, or some of them had very different agendas as well that were somehow tangentially related to this issue.
Now, another question on another subject from BR1 in New York City. He writes, I and many others are concerned that any reforms that come out of Copenhagen will be toothless rules that will be gamed by governments and industry with no actual changes ever happening. Respond to that.
That question came from someone who is spot on something. There is a concern among those who really are worried about the buildup of these gases that a lot of this is on paper, and what you want to see is what would really happen on the ground. The 1997 Kyoto Protocol bound a certain number of countries to curb emissions, but it turned out that it was pretty hard to do that all on your own soil in Europe and Japan. So quite often they would buy offsets, what are called offsets, and it's still unclear how well they're going to meet their targets when those deadlines are hit in a couple of years. And then the rest of the world, of course, has just seen emissions rise pretty relentlessly, with a little downward tick because of the recession the last year or two.
Question from another skeptic. Bill in Washington wants to know, how do green energy funds go to countries with 100 years of endemic corruption and not get siphoned off to make a few people rich?
This is a big issue here, actually. Developing countries are demanding a lot of funds that would flow from industrialized countries to help them divert from just using fossil fuels, to help them get more energy options so they can come out of poverty without adding pollution to the atmosphere, and to help them adapt to climate risks. And how that money gets spent is a big issue for the people who would be paying the bills. The industrialized countries want to have clear, what they call measurable, reportable, and verifiable action on emissions. They want to be able to check the books, essentially, so you can't kind of fake it. There are big issues related to the forest projects that are proposed here. And this is a way that the lack of governance or the presence of corruption can cut in a different way. So if there's a lot of money flowing to cut deforestation in developing countries, probably in most cases the last place it would go are the frontier zones in Indonesia and a few places in the Amazon or South Asia, where the deforestation rates are the worst. You have the least governance, so you don't get money flowing there at all. So it can kind of cut both ways.
Andy, Oscar in New Jersey asked this. According to a recent New York Times report, and the headline was, "New data shows warming increased in last decade," the Times is saying there's been warming in the last decade. However, an October article in the journal Science reports that there hasn't been warming in a decade. So who's right?
Well, I think what you're hearing there is confusion about the difference between climate change and climate variability. Climate change is when the system is changing, and there's a clear trend underway for decades now that hasn't really diverted, that has a lot of wiggles on the way to a warmer world. So the upward graph has ups and downs, and people who've claimed that the last decade has seen no warming are starting from a year, 1998, when we had a very unusual hot year because of an El Nino, one of these big warm pools in the Pacific that formed. So it was actually naturally hot that year, but that created a high peak in temperature. And then we've had a series of years that have been kind of up and down in a sawtooth fashion. And if you just pick the year at the end and the year at the beginning, you'd say, hey, there's no warming. But if you use statistics to analyze the whole long trend over decades, you see there clearly is warming underway. This is basically the difference between weather and climate, and it's all about the long-term picture. The robustness of the picture of global warming caused by humans is in that century scale or half-century scale, not in the year-to-year patterns.
Andy, one more question related to a little bit to science, but a little bit to coverage of the issue. Steve Pesci in California wants to know, is the media taking the stance that there's no need for further debate about global warming? And if so, isn't the nature of science to have a hypothesis, to test that hypothesis and create a new hypothesis if necessary? So how do you square those two things?
Science is a journey, and the best coverage of global warming, whether I'm doing it or anybody else is to convey that the level of understanding is always evolving. And the robustness of the picture of a human-warmed world right now has nothing to do with this idea of the case being closed. Some people have tried to portray it that way. It's way too simplistic. It's a body of evidence. It's broad and deep, and it points to rising risk with rising temperature. And rising emissions are firmly understood to warm the planet. There's a lot of real questions, though, and I've written about them. Sometimes I get hammered by all sides in this debate. People who think it's a catastrophe, those who think it's a hoax, find my coverage uncomfortable sometimes, perhaps, because I'm essentially saying it's a more complicated picture than that. And what you have to do is step back and just understand that there's really nothing that cuts from that long-term picture, especially when you just think of this. Basically, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We know that. It's part of why the planet is warmer than is not a frozen ice ball. And adding more to the atmosphere will warm the world. There's even Michael Crichton, the novelist who's passed away, he told me that and spoke about that in a debate. He didn't disagree with that. And what you can find dispute on, real dispute, not manufactured dispute, are very important details. So we still look at science and hurricanes. In 1988, when I first wrote a big piece about global warming, scientists were telling me that they expected a 50% rise in the intensity of hurricanes in a warmed world in this century. Now it's much more nuanced. It's a picture of probably more intense storms getting stronger, but fewer storms overall. So how do you, it's not there, that's not a no-brainer. It's complicated. And unfortunately, that doesn't fit very easily into a short newspaper story or a short TV report. So what I hope is that readers kind of come along for the long haul.
Andy, thank you so much for all the hard work that you do, and thanks for taking time out to talk to us in Copenhagen. We'll be back again soon.
It's going to be getting cold here in the next few days, as you can see too, so that'll generate some ironic headlines, I'm sure.
Okay. Andy, take care.
Thanks.